think we're live.
Yeah.
Excellent.
We're live now.
Excellent, excellent. So I would like to welcome our Ugandan audience, the East African audience, as well as the global audience to this Africa Leaders Gathering session. My name is Angela Izama, and I am head of faculty at the Leo Africa Institute. It is my unique pleasure, to participate in this conversation about Africa and the diaspora. This was included in the program, obviously, because what is happening in the continent is connected, even more so today, and especially even more so today in this year, 2020, with what's going on around the world. And because, being African and being Black has been central to the experience of some of the things that we have witnessed, in and around the world. Now, the Leo Africa Institute basically focuses on leadership as an answer to the contemporary challenges we face. And as a result of that, one of our flagship programs is the Young and Emerging Leaders Program Fellowship. And I'm glad to say that there's several of our alumni who are participating on this call. But I want to say something about what I do as head of faculty at the Institute. It is a fairly recent position here at the Institute. I'm the inaugural head of faculty, and the position has been designed for someone to lead a quality sort of interaction between ourselves, our partners, and the fellows who are part of particularly the Young and Emerging Leaders Program. In the course of my time, I had developed about 4 principles which I want to share with our audience, which are meant to help young leaders identify what is authentic African leadership, as opposed to leaders in Africa, because those two things we hold them separate. One of them is clarity, that at any one time, we should be as clear as possible about what we're dealing with when it comes to leadership challenges, when it comes to challenges in Africa. And that the ability to zero in on the facts, to be very brutal with our realities and to accept those realities as they are, is so crucial, because in the course of dealing with leadership challenges and resolving problems in Africa, there can be a lot of confusion as to what is going on. One of them, for example, these days is this debate about the form of government that is relevant to the experience of justice and equality and all these things. So the first thing we tell our fellows is just be as clear as possible and bring a range of clarity to bear on your subject. So this is important to even us who are on this call, because we accept that in Africa there tends to be a lot of confusion about the continent, about what is going on, about our history, about our challenges, and a lot of that is a narrative that is controlled outside the continent. So clarity is one of the first things we put on the table for our fellows, and we want to share this with our audience. The second thing is knowledge. And by knowledge, I don't mean what you can find on Google, though that is important. We refer to knowledge as the ability to generate your own perspectives, and to do so relying on your own information. because as we know, the global library is full. It's packed with information about, especially about Africa. We are one of the most studied continents in the world, but the quality of scholarship that is often brought to bear on African issues leaves a lot to be desired. First of all, it is largely, again, you know, imported, and knowledge is appropriated for the needs of other people. So at the Institute, we want to rely on our own information. We can, of course, find once again, a range of sources of information, but there are some things that we want to rely on ourselves. And developing that ability to find the relevant information you need is so important, because as Black Africans, you want to rely, especially these days, on your own independent perspective. And authentic leadership particularly allows you to reach out and connect with sources of information that best present your perspectives. And this is part of the independence that we seek for ourselves and for our fellows, that you should go there confident on your own information. Don't rely too much on what others people say, and also don't rely too much on the validation that others may have about what you know, because this is really important when you go out there. Sometimes they want to say, where's your degree from? Is it from Harvard? I can see some Harvard, alumni amongst our friends here. Is it from Georgetown? And so on and so forth. All of those things are important, yes, but we accept you purely on the basis that you are from where you say you are, and we respect what you know, regardless of where your degree is from or regardless of your training prior. So clarity and knowledge. The third, perhaps most important thing, especially for this subject of Black African diaspora, is empathy. If you look around the world, there sometimes appears to be a lot of empathy about the history of Africa, African suffering, and so on and so forth. A lot of that I find in my own, it's good, it's emotional, it kind of lays a pattern of what the continent is suffered, particularly, our civil wars, the history of slavery, and so on and so forth. But the empathy that is missing is a sort of race empathy that is about the brotherhood that we share as Africans. And it is a first stop to say that, look, because you're Black, we identify with you. And that even as we deal with, the various challenges that we deal with, we recognize that being Black, that puts us in the special category. Often when we deal with today's contemporary challenges our leaders are facing, whatever, there's a tendency to put us in a category of people who are not underachieving, who, for example, should be at the same level with other races and peoples. So there's, for authentic leaders such as yourselves and such as our fellows, we tell them, when something is presented to you and as a Black issue, simply engage your empathy, because we understand that our history is different, is difficult, and that whether you're from Senegal or from South Africa or from the DRC or from Uganda, or whether you live outside of the continent, there is always going to be something about being Black that you should remember, and that it is important to share that empathy wherever you go, because there are people who do not share that empathy, in fact, who deal with us in a way through a lack of empathy. And our history is full of this kind of examples of where, we are treated as somehow as subhuman, or we are treated as things, or we are treated as, markets, so on and so forth. So we want to embrace ourselves in a cloak of Black empathy, and to remind ourselves that, that empathy is going to be something we have to self-generate everywhere we go and bring it to our issues. So when you, especially if you're in the diaspora, when you meet someone who is Black, you will know this because they acknowledge you. They say, we see you, we see you're Black. This is the empathy we refer to. It also allows us not to judge ourselves with unfair standards, and also, not to judge ourselves by the standards set elsewhere. So empathy allows us the emotional range to know when something is going bad, when we should feel strongly about it, and also when we should give ourselves a pass, even as we confront issues of the day. And finally, this is the last of the principles that I developed here at the Institute. It is basically about volunteerism. Most of our fellows, we tell them that leadership is basically about taking action. So for those who are coming into this webinar and who are listening to us around the world, first, we welcome your participation. That is one way of taking action. But we essentially will rely on you who are self-aware, who are self-informed, who are empathetic about African issues, that wherever you are as a professional, as a human being, that when it comes to Black issues, that you take action. You join some kind of association with this knowledge in mind. You act within your own organization with these principles in mind. And you contribute to society in the best way and the best traditions of African leaders around the world. So welcome once again. And I'm going to go straight to one of my colleagues on the panel here, Hawa Mariam Keita, who's in Canada. And I believe the weather is now turning where she is. It's slightly cold now. And begin with a question for this conversation on Black diaspora. To me, what does it mean to be Black today, wherever you are, and what issues does it raise? Hawa?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Angelo, for the introduction. So yes, I would like, first of all, to introduce myself. My name is Hawa. I am based in Montreal, Canada. I'm the executive director of Seed Concordia. So we focus on youth development and skills development. And we're based between Montreal and Gulu. And another element is that I'm from Senegal and I grew up in France and now live in Canada. And so my identity has always been, a great interest in my whole life, to understand a little bit more what it's like to be actually part of the diaspora, Black diaspora, what it's like to be Black, what it's like to be African and Senegalese as well. And so to answer your question, what I would define as what's being part of, what's being Black nowadays, it's first of all, being part of a very diverse community. That's the first element that I would like to acknowledge. And it is also part of, the wealth of being Black, and also part of the influence that we have around the world, not only throughout our culture, but also with all the different, role models that we have around the world, and we have to acknowledge. And I think something that my fathers have always told me since a very young age, as a Black, and especially as a Black woman, you have to work 2 times harder in order to achieve approximately the same as someone else who do not necessarily have your Black identity. And I think it's very important to remember that aspect, because like we usually focus a lot on, no, I'm not going to say negativity, but like the barriers that we have. However, I take my Black identity and African identity as a motive to achieve even more than what I was expecting. And I think this is a mandate and something that so many of us have understood, and especially part of the diaspora, and being part of, like, being a minority, understanding that the realities as a Black person or as a white person, whether we're in the same social economical background, are not necessarily the same. So yeah, to summarize.
Thank you, Hawa. And Jean-Luc, I'm going to turn to you. Hawa says something interesting about being Black and what it means in terms in the professional world, that this often signals that you're working twice as hard as everyone else. And we take it for granted that this is going to be, if you're a Black professional, especially around the world, this is what's going to happen. What does it mean to be Black where you are, and what issues does it raise?
Thank you, Angelo, and thank you for the introduction and the invitation. And I think my story is a little bit close to what Hawa also said. I'm working for the Basketball Africa League. It's a new initiative of the NBA. I'm also the co-founder of an organization that uses the game of basketball as an educational tool in Togo and in Cote d'Ivoire. I was born in Togo. I grew up in France. I came back on the continent 7 years ago, and now I'm based in Senegal, in Dakar. I think being Black, as Hawa said, it's a huge challenge. And the fact that I grew up with white people, I never actually realized that it was a big difference. It's only when you start working that you realize that can be an issue. I have the chance now. I came back on the continent. I found my place, but I can say, openly that it's an issue. The first time I applied to get a job at the NBA, it was like 8 years ago, and people would tell you that you need to have the right passport. So I can say that 10 years ago it was a big issue. Now we're seeing that things are changing. Everybody wants to come on the continent. So it's not a challenge anymore on my side to be Black because I'm on my continent, and we're seeing that we're creating opportunities here. So my Black identity, I'm fine with it. I'm at the right place. I also encourage people to come back on the continent because we need to build this continent. We need to create these things. So all of those things that is happening now around the world about these racial issues, I can understand. But me, I just took the time, to come back here to build something. This is the only place where we can be really comfortable. So we are all dealing with that. But me personally, with my Black identity, I'm glad with that because I'm on my continent and things are easier now for me.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Let me bring it down to someone who I think may have been recently abroad, but is from Uganda, who we call Trish, but is Twasima. Do you mind if I call you Trish, Twasima?
I don't mind. I don't mind.
Trish is sort of, she's, I could say something about her for our audience because, she's part of our faculty here. She's a well-known African feminist and lawyer and human rights activist, by way of introduction to Asima. But what being in Uganda now and having been recently at Georgetown Law in America, what kind of issues does being a Black African woman raise for you?
Hi, Angelo. Thanks, and hi, everybody. So I think that there are very many historical fluctuations that complicate that answer, specifically as a Black, but also specifically as an African woman who has lived mostly on this continent. So my realities and my everyday realities are very different from, cis men on the continent, and they're very different from diaspora sisters as well, because my reality is shaped by both my Blackness, but also my womanness. And those are inherently sometimes invisible to many others. And so even when we think about Blackness, we need to recognize that there are variations in many cases, right? Like there are things that we, for example, I don't even know if we can come to a collective understanding of what being Black means when we are still addressing things like gender identity and, is it African to be queer? Is it African to be non-binary? And, what are women's places in African societies and things like that? So it's a difficult answer. I don't think there's an easier way to put it. I do think that Blackness in of itself is a political evocation, because especially being African, right? Because that in itself is just a political stance, whether or not you want, because the world inherently forces you to constantly be, fighting and demanding for your rights, for better, etc. and etc. So we have that collective understanding, but there's also very many unique experiences which also alter our ability to collectively mobilize and address the bigger issues that we need to be addressing.
Thank you, Trish, and we'll get back to this in perhaps in the subsequent conversation, as in what circumstances does our identity stand in the way of dealing with other primary issues, structural issues, which we share as a global community, such as human rights, gender identity, in the case of the issue raised by Tricia. Where Africans are required to step up and go beyond their interests and embrace something that is greater. Like, for example, in the world today, dealing with our global environment, in circumstances where we are already at a disadvantage because we don't have the kind of technology and the background to participate at the rate of other nations. But Rebecca, do you want to go next?
Thank you. So I wanted to say something when it comes to the questions you asked earlier. I hope that is okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So to me, when it comes to my Black identity, it reminds me of that great responsibility I have every now and then, right? It's like that burden that sits with me that I walk with wherever I'm going. So even when I come to this part of the world, there is no freedom for me at all. There is still that greater responsibility that you have to represent a certain group of people. You have to be the overseer when it comes to certain things. You have to do it right. You cannot say something else that is going to probably conflict everybody else. But then the one thing about my Black identity or my African identity is being aware that I was born into a system or a country or a continent whose decisions or whose future was already determined by people who have no interest in it or who are not interested in its prosperity, right? So every time I make decisions, I don't make them for myself. I'm reminded that I'm making them myself, my future, the continent, the country at large, and it gets tough every now and then. But then, as other panelists said, right? I think it was Howard, actually, to hint on what Howard said. Howard said, you have to work hard. You have to work twice as hard to achieve a half of what they have, right? And such statements make it hard for me to even navigate my Blackness, because sometimes I just want to enjoy it and just be Black and African. But then such statements, the burden, reading books, having to sit in class and being reminded that you have this responsibility, you're not free. And unfortunately, my Blackness comes with that burden. My African identity comes with that burden. So I actually look forward to speaking of a Black identity where it's just freedom. It's just, something like I can just walk around, I can just make decisions and not feel burdened at all to do whatever I have to do. Yeah.
Very well, and thank you. I want to say that for Ugandans and for some people around the world who are watching, they'll look at the hat you're wearing and understand some of the issues that it raises about freedom. But we will leave that for a second. Leonard, do you want to go next? I wanted to say that the last time I saw you actually was, I think, the inaugural Leo Africa meeting that was held as part of a Pan-Africanist, Pan-Africanist affair in Kigali. So almost 5 or 6 years ago. And you and a couple of your colleagues were, part of the Rwandan Black, professional business community that were looking to bring, these values to Africa. And Rwanda is often held as the crucible of, progressive and incremental change in Africa. And recently, there's big story concerning the business community in Africa and concerning particularly Black Africa that had to do with the terrible experience that the former head of Credit Suisse went through while he was heading that bank, Tijani. And just a couple of weeks ago, I think, there was a news report that after this Black professional had gone through what he did, the government of Rwanda had brought him on board. Him and his, globally recognized skill is now going to be invested in Rwanda, where he's going to head I think it's the Rwanda Finance Board. Could you tell us some, and I've given a sort of a different background to your answer, but could you tell us, about what it means to be a Rwandan Black business person operating under this environment?
Thank you, Angelo, and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Leo Africa Forum, for your kind invitation. Hello, everyone. Good morning from wherever part of the world you are. Good evening, good afternoon, hamjambo, bonsoir, bonjour, muraho, mulimutia. A big thank you to the organizers for putting together this virtual event amidst the challenges that we are all facing right now amidst this pandemic and the ensuing economic and health crisis. Let me first start with your first question about what it means to be Black. And I think for me, it starts with the understanding that I'm a human being first and foremost, and that I deserve to live a life of dignity and respect. And the second thing for me, being Black means fully embracing myself and embracing others with confidence, with humility and empathy to engage with that understanding and with that kind of respect. The third thing, I guess, for me would be being Black also means celebrating Africa and celebrating other Africans, whether it's about made in East Africa or made in West Africa, made in South Africa, promoting the African story, African brand, African culture, pop culture, music, and embracing that and celebrating that, realizing that yes, we are fraught with many challenges, but that we can actually collectively, address those challenges. And I think an example worth noting and celebrating is how Africa has handled the recent COVID-19 crisis, and how together from the AU level, leaders collectively got together and created a platform, for example, to procure medical supplies and equipment, so that we're not just price takers, but we can also negotiate as a bloc And that platform is also going to perhaps help many African countries collectively procure vaccines now that vaccines are being discovered. So for me, it's about celebrating those stories, notwithstanding that we still have to address those challenges. And by way of background, I am Rwandan, yes, by origin, but I always describe myself as an East African global citizen. And the reason is, I've lived in most of East Africa and to a less extent Southern Africa, and most recently, briefly though, in the US. And so, yes, I feel deeply connected to Rwanda as part of my identity and culture, but I'm also an African who seeks to understand other people, people's cultures, values, and this is just not Africa only. It's not limited to just Africa. It's limited to understanding other people, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in the US or Europe. And these recent events this year has reminded us, starkly so, that we are ever more deeply connected. And I therefore envision a deeply connected continent where, especially the youth, it's so exciting to see the youth on the panel, where they can choose to live and thrive anywhere on the continent. I also imagine a future where Africa's voice is increasingly heard and its influence felt. But to do that, we need to fix a number of things, which I guess we're going to discuss as part of this conversation, and I'm happy to get into that later on. But to your second question about Rwanda being a progressive country, the business environment, I do agree with you, Angelo, but I must add with a caveat that it's still work in progress. There's a lot of work that needs to be done from a socioeconomic development perspective to business, to private sector, youth empowerment, gender inclusion, climate change, name it, everything is work in progress. And whereas government has really been driving the business reform agenda to make it ever more conducive and create an enabling environment for businesses, both domestically and regionally, as well as globally, to operate, there's still a lot of work to be done, so that perhaps there's going to be increased investments from the region, increased intra-African trade and investments, as well as investments from outside Africa. To your specific mention of the recent titan in the finance world, Tijan, it's such a great and welcome move for the financial world in Rwanda. And at the same time, it's not new, because Rwanda for the last 26 years has always been open to partnerships, to collaboration, to understanding that we don't know it all and that we need to also learn from the best that there is. And the benefit is that there's a lot of talented Africans on the continent and outside. So Tijan is one of those. And so Rwanda is extremely lucky to have such talent and skills to come and help grow the financial ecosystem in Rwanda, and hopefully within the region and the continent. And so we celebrate him coming to Rwanda. He's joining the board for the Rwanda Finance Limited, along with other skilled and talented Africans. But Angelo, it's not the first time that we've seen this kind of skills coming to Rwanda. Let's take the example of the AU reform, and remember that when President Kagame was leading that reform agenda, he surrounded himself with talent from all over the continent, from Cape to Cairo, from east to west, and they did an amazing job. Women and men from the continent, and I think that is a spirit that should transcend borders, so that the Africa we want is really an Africa where we can all move and work and live and engage socially and economically with each other. I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. And this is really the direction that I wanted us to go, which is because we don't have that much time, not to dwell on some of the challenges, even if I recognize that the panel have mentioned the importance of dignity and the challenge of attaining dignity for Africans, both in the continent and in the diaspora, and the relative lack of freedom that being Black comes with. But we also see, as Leonard has mentioned, that there are opportunities while recognizing our challenges to push forward And I'll have Fiona coming next, and then I would like after that to shift to some of the examples and personal stories that you may have about so the positive movement, if you'd like, that being Black entails, and particularly what it means to be Black and in the diaspora, and being in a position to contribute uniquely to the experience on the continent. Fiona? You need to unmute your mic though.
Yes. Thank you very much, Angelo. From my colleagues' answers, we'll notice that it's overwhelming to organize a global movement around Black identity in all these different contexts and histories. It's true that we have a certain affinity based on race, but that itself cannot sustain this movement. If you've noticed, and I'm sure all of us have experienced this, Africa is always associated with misery. If we talk about leadership, from the recently closed elections in the United States, Trump refusing to concede, everyone is saying, oh, he's pulling off an African president move. If you look at how they were expecting the COVID-19 response from Africa, all that, they were expecting Africa to fail. And I think that's something that we as young African leaders should change. If we as African on the continent and everywhere manage to bring back the dignity we owe to ourselves and building a continent that uses its full potential, people of African descent everywhere, be it in the US, in Europe, in South America, in Asia, and we've seen stories from China after the COVID outbreak. There were very many conspiracy theories that it was from it's Black people who brought it to China. And I think if we bring back that dignity that we have and we had as Africa, I think people of African descent will be respected wherever they are. And I think that's our responsibility as young leaders, and to make sure that you mentioned that leadership is about taking actions. And I think we should make sure that this conversation that we're having today, that brought together people from Canada, from Senegal, Rwanda, Uganda, everywhere. And we need to make sure that these conversations that we're having right now, feminists, we need to make sure that these conversations don't end in Leo Africa Institute archives. So actions, and again, actions. That will be my contribution to this conversation. Thank you, Angela.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We've all gone round and said some things about this subject of being Black, particularly being Black and in the diaspora, and some of the issues it raises around the continent. So I'm going to open the floor. Like I said, I'd like to hear, what is moving in the positive direction. The example of Tijan in Rwanda, you have this titan of global commerce who, when he was ejected from Credit Suisse, the global finance community recognized it, but we recognize it as Black professionals for his maltreatment. And so he's coming back and contributing in a unique way to Rwanda. I thought that was one of the positive stories that happened this year, at least for me. And then an example of two things, really. One is that whenever we talk about Black people in the diaspora, it is often referred to as, Black people living outside the continent. But obviously, again, seen from this panel, Africa is very diverse. And there's an internal diaspora, if you'd like. People like Leonard and this have lived in multiple African countries, can attest to the uniqueness of being within Africa, just alone. It's very different in North Africa, very different in East Africa, very different in South Africa, certainly very different in West Africa, where I've hardly been. So sometimes when we think about Black and the diaspora, I think to a certain extent, it would be good to include the feeling of actually being in Africa, but not quite being there because of how different it is from where you are born. So the interaction within Africa, this is one of the the key areas at the Institute we talk about. The opening up of borders also means opening up to an internal diaspora, which is perhaps even more important to us. So that story of Tijani coming to work in Rwanda, that for me is one of the more positive things that have happened. So that going from there, and I'll open the floor. Any one of you can answer this question, which is, in what positive way has being Black and being in the diaspora, what kind of examples do you have to say that we are sort of moving in a positive direction with regard to the relationship between Africa and her diasporas?
If I may, Angelo, I think for me, it's the level of consciousness that Africans now have about their collective Blackness, about their individual Blackness. So there's a level, I think, of collective solidarity that perhaps previously wasn't just as evident. And for me, even when you look at like the ways in which we struggle, but the ways in which communities embrace each other and the ways in which we should have to support each other across, right? For me, even just looking at like the NSAS movement in the diaspora, because for a long time it really did seem like Africa's issues were Africa's issues. But I think for me that collective solidarity is an indication, one, of the consciousness that we now have, but two, of the willingness to do the work to transform our societies, right? Because if we all understand like the structural issues, yes, but the fact that people are now willing to do whatever it takes to be able to transform our societies, even when they're not here physically, for me, I think is a huge indication of progress, but also that it is actually possible for us to organize across differences and like manifest this world that we really want to live in.
Hawa?
Thank you. So I also wanted to, like, the question that you asked was very linked to one of the questions asked here from Awel asking, so what's the experience of as an African living in North America and now working on a Canada and Africa project, and how does like the opportunities and challenges of working in Africa as African Canadian are like. So like as I said in the beginning, so like I'm currently working with SEED, which is a nonprofit organization based between Montreal and Gulu. And so like one element, so everybody was saying like it's very important to actually take actions when it's like about, how do you want to improve, the image of your continent, or also like the conditions of the people who are part of your identity. And so like what I wanted to say is that I took the occasion to work at SEED in order to change, like I would say, the narrative that we have about Africa in the West. So for example, like when we talk about international cooperation or international development, there is, I think, a narrative that we have. Yes, we have to help Africa in order to be better, but like yes, like we need to help in a way, but it's not like fully this, like there is like so much potential, and, like showing like the different opportunities that our continent have, and basically it's about like providing experience and showing a totally different narrative about our Black identity, but also I think what's the most important that we have to think about is like how is our continent going, right? What's going on in our continent? And I think like the very first step is like the development and the enrichment of like the African development. And then I think like the African diaspora, for example, in other places such as North America, China, would have, I'd say, like a little bit less challenges that we face.
So Jean-Luc, if I could come to you and stay in West Africa, a couple of my friends, including actually a Ugandan member of our wider community, were engaged in Ghana's year of return. And there was a little buzz about what that meant for Black diaspora to be able to go back to Ghana or other parts of West Africa as a positive sort of direction of Africa embracing its diaspora and including it in the continent's path forward. Is there an example of what this means as being a professional who has lived elsewhere and come back to work on the continent?
Sorry, I missed your question. Can you just repeat the last 5 seconds of your question?
Oh, sorry. I was saying that the year of return in Ghana is being held up as, the sort of thing that other African countries should do to embrace the diaspora, if you'd like. I was asking, is there another example, being in your position as someone who has lived elsewhere and come back to work on the continent, that you could point to as sort of the direction we should be going?
Sure, and what the Ghana government did for the diaspora and for the communities is just amazing. When I came back 7 years ago, I think it was not like that. You have to struggle to find your place, and I think for the diaspora, it's extremely difficult when you come back after like 10, 15 years. So I think it was a real inspiration what the Ghana government realized. And I won't talk about a country. The best example I can give is what the NBA is doing with the Basketball Africa League. It's we want to create something on the continent, something that can inspire people and something that can encourage our people to come back. So the league we are developing is going to help to keep our talent on the continent, but also this diaspora who's living in France, who's living in Europe, who's living in the US, to see the continent differently. And that's the biggest challenge, is to create the environment. I think it's Fiona who said that we used to have this negative, approach of the continent, and we used to associate Black with something negative. Even me, when I needed to come back on the continent, I was like, the place to be if you want to launch a career is New York, is Montreal, is it's in Europe. But in people's mind, Africa is not the place where you can when you can become successful. So I think the best example for me is what we're doing with the Basketball Africa League, and encourage people every day to understand that things can start here. And in my opinion, that's the biggest challenge for the diaspora. We need to be in that position where we come back to serve the continent. Most of the time we are like, we know everything, we come back and we're going to teach them. And I'm glad that I came back here. I spend a lot of time in my village, and I just take the time to listen to people. And I'm glad that in our team, we are 13 people. The majority, we have those two culture, and it's a great feeling to have all of those people, coming back, listening, and trying to understand the continent, and trying to use what we learn overseas to contribute to create an environment where we can, show another face of the continent and create a new narrative.
Rebecca, if I may come to you, there's Trish Twasima said something important about the rising consciousness amongst Black and young Africans about their issues, and that there's a sort of the isolation that used to be the experience around the world that has changed. I imagine this has to do with technology as well. But where you're sitting, what would you say is moving in the right direction, especially with the question of, you know, when we think about the rights of young Black Africans? Are there examples you can give apart from NSAS that show that we are taking, you know, direct action and moving in a positive direction?
Yes, definitely we are moving to that direction. As Tricia said, actually, seeing the collective solidarity of young Africans is something inspiring, to be honest. Waking up to seeing the continent going through all that, but then seeing people in the diaspora stand out and keep pushing because they know what the continent could go through. You know, when you're aware that you probably came from a country where internet could be shut down and the country is entirely blocked out from the entire continent. As the diaspora, I saw people push out those tweets. People kept protesting this side, people kept sending in donations just to keep the protests alive on the continent. And that to me told me that there is hope, that we should not give up. It wasn't just now being on Twitter or on Facebook, which was also very important, but now sending the money back home, not just for education, but now to sustain those protests, to show your resentment against the injustices that you're going through. Because most times we have this belief that, you know, certain protests cannot be sustained, they don't have the money to, but then seeing people keep pushing this on, it was actually very inspiring. And to be honest, speaking about Nigeria, seeing Nigerians take that stance finally was something very inspiring for me, because I had asked myself for a very long time, when is Nigeria going to take action? We kept quoting Nigeria standing up to this, Nigeria being innovative. And I just kept asking myself, when is Nigeria taking this stance? And seeing the young people come out this way was very inspiring. I said it was about time. And I'm very proud of Nigeria, to be honest. And seeing countries like Namibia as well, the young women going out there on the streets, and still seeing Africa come out and stand with them was something I admired. The collective solidarity is something we should keep building. But then for us to sustain it, we need to definitely understand where its roots are, where our consciousness comes from. It's not something we're just going to ride on and, you know, it won't be organic or sustainable in the long run. But then we need to know where we are coming from, which actually may be, it actually reminds me of something else I realized about Africa when it comes to our internal diaspora. Not even, let me not bring in the diaspora out of the continent, but just the inside one. Looking, if I was Ugandan, then I'm talking about probably Nigeria, South Africa, and all that. I realized that as Africans, we have a bias for English-speaking and French-speaking Africa. So when I came to Germany, I realized that I had that sort of leaning to the English-speaking Africans, and to a certain extent then to French-speaking Africa. And then I realized that there was a gap between myself and other Africans who did not speak those two languages, that even in solidarity building, there was a problem with it. So this pushed me to actually inform myself and to look beyond English-speaking and French-speaking Africa. So I had to build my consciousness, knowing that, you know what, I have to do much more. I have to educate myself in this part of the world. We have each other. We have to fight for each other. So I have to look beyond colonial languages. It's now knowing my Black identity, the responsibility that comes with it, and knowing that we have to stand together when it comes to these issues. Yeah.
Leonard, you said something that in your beginning, you actually, you know, referenced several languages: French, Rwanda, and Swahili, and so on and so forth. I want to come back to you and and remind actually our global audience that one of the positive things to come out of Rwanda with regard to Africa's, if you like, internal diaspora, is that you can now travel visa-free to Rwanda from any part of Africa. Are there other examples of this push to embrace the Black diaspora and its opportunities that you'd like to share with, especially when it comes to this space that you occupy, which is innovation and business and creating value for as you say, to invest in dignity at home?
Thank you, Angelo. And I want to pick up from where Rebecca ended around languages. So I went to this high school in Uganda that afforded us opportunities to study German, although I don't know any word after Guten Morgen or Danke. And they also taught Arabic, right? And so as a parent of 2 young children, I also encourage them to embrace French and German, and they actually take up the subject at school, and most recently Chinese as well. And because I want them to be able to engage without any language barrier across Africa and outside Africa, I encourage them and I urge them on to take on language. But that also ties to the 2-3 things that I thought about when Angelo, you triggered the conversation in preparation for this event around current migration trends and institutions in place on the continent to engage with the diaspora and with the economic impact of diaspora. And Rebecca, to an extent, touched on one of those things, which is internal diaspora on the continent. I was reading that 34 million Africans currently live outside their country of birth, and that 55% of those Africans are currently within Africa, and 45% are outside of Africa. And that number is going to grow from 34 million to 100 million by 2050, and that most will remain on the continent. So what does it mean, Angelo, to your question about visa openness and border openness? And we're starting to see a lot of that with the AU passport, even within our own region in East Africa, with the dismantling of visa restrictions. I mean, I can come to Kampala with my ID. Students can travel across borders with their IDs or voter registration cards. I can go to Juba, I can go to Nairobi. And the idea is that we can do that beyond East Africa, but across the continent, where it's going to be easier and cheaper. And the story is the same with making it more affordable to fly across the continent without having to go to Middle East, to go to Morocco or Tunis, and similarly to dismantle trade barriers so that we are increasing intra-African and intra-regional trade. And I think the CFTA is a fantastic tool, an opportune time where we're increasingly working together to level the playing field. The other thing is about youth, and many of you have spoken about that. I am fortunate that I work in an environment where it's pretty much the young people between age 25 and 35 who work here. Right now, 80% of my colleagues are African, while 20% are non-African, and they come from as far as Morocco, Liberia, South Africa, Botswana. Many of them are super young, brilliant. Yes, they've gone to study outside, but guess what? They chose to come back because they feel a deep sense of responsibility to the continent, and they value that they can create here on the continent wherever they're working, and in shaping the Africa that they want and that we all want. The second thing that I think we always think about when we talk about diaspora is remittances, and obviously remittances have been increasing until COVID struck, and so remittances will drastically go down because both the recipients, when you talk about forex bureaus and money exchange, have closed or have been closed for quite some time, and diaspora, are also struggling to meet their own needs given the pandemic and job losses. So there's been a lot of remittances to countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana. But one of the things that also learned is that it's just not about the money to needy family members that diaspora send. It's also about the investment flows and the partnerships that are flourishing but underreported that we need to perhaps also celebrate. And finally, to your question, Angela, about what can be done, I think African governments across the continent have created institutions to foster deeper engagements between their country and the diaspora. And we're seeing that, with consular networks, with ministries or public-private bodies. I'll give the example of Rwanda, where there's a department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that coordinates Rwandan community abroad through events like Rwanda Day, which have taken place in Kampala, in Bonn, Germany, in San Francisco. And the idea is to really deepen that engagement and encourage Rwandans to want to come back, those who want to come back and contribute to the country's socio-economic development, but also to create that deep understanding and appreciation of their country. And I think the same is true for other African countries that are seeking to connect people within their country and in diaspora. And it would be remiss of me not to talk about music and fashion and Afrobeats and its global popularity, which has been largely driven by the diaspora. And I think we need to celebrate that because it is tapped and it's now building the momentum. We celebrate musicians from as far as South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, and I think Africa can capitalize on some of these opportunities as we think about harnessing the power of the diaspora. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leonard, in fact, for bringing in the arts back to one of my projects. As some of you know, is film as a language. And maybe I can say one or two things about it. For example, right now, we are in a medium of communication, which is superior, essentially because it includes both sound and visual. And I often say that film is really the future language that human beings are going to use to communicate directly with each other, and will trump many things, including language, this spoken word and written text and things like that. And when it comes to the global content production, when it comes to film, I agree. With music, a lot of that is shifting. Especially when it comes to Africa, you see a lot more Africanness in global products, musical products, and so on and so forth. But I also see that the technology has allowed in once in a generation kind of fashion that young Africans can now get on a computer, record a video, basically create their own content to try and offset what has now traditionally been content dominated by film production elsewhere. And this is really, for me, going in the kind of positive direction that I do not know where it's going to lead in the next 50 or so years, but I can get a sense that there's an opportunity for us to tell our own stories, and that content creators no longer have to refer to content elsewhere. If you want to listen to purely African playlists, you can do so. If you want to watch purely African products, you can do so. But also, young critical thinkers can engage with African issues from their own perspectives because the technology is now available. And I'm very excited about that. Maybe, someone is going to create an African Netflix in the next 10 years that is successful. I look forward to that. But let me come to Fiona. You are part of the alumni here for the Young and Emerging Leaders program. And on the question of language, I said earlier, before we came on before we began the live broadcast, that I look at what's happening in Brazil, which is really huge and one of the biggest African populations outside the continent. And the language there, of course, I think it's Portuguese, has created the barrier. And despite the fact that they are dealing with major issues of inequality, of colorism, of racism, stuff that we recognize, they say, in North America and in Europe or elsewhere, China now, or on the continent, we don't engage with it that much. Do you have any ideas of how we can begin to deal with some of these barriers between us and other Black populations that are underrepresented in our conversation?
Thank you very much. I like the way you introduced this conversation. And now I'll give an example from something that happened in Rwanda not long ago. I think it was like a month or two months ago. A famous TikToker, I'm not sure if that's what they call them, famous person on TikTok, visited Rwanda. She's an influencer, so she was on a Visit Rwanda tour, and she visited. When she landed, she tested positive COVID-19, and she took it to TikTok and she took it to TikTok and talked about Africa, that she doesn't think that her test was positive, sorry, because she had tested positive before, and she used very many racist words, and probably and then when people started engaging her, she started lying about the situation, and most people in Rwanda, they noticed and they were commenting in Kinyarwanda, which I don't think was going to solve the issue, because this person was addressing us in English. And she also mentioned that she had a language barrier with the guide, the hotel people, the team that, the medical team that tested her. And it was very, very funny because when you reach the Kigali International Airport, they ask you which language you want to be addressed in. Do you speak English? Vous parlez français? Vous parlez Kinyarwanda? The three official languages in our country. And she mentioned that there was a language barrier in Rwanda. And because I also understand, because most of the content that most people take on TikTok, which is her platform, her preferred platform, where in Kinyarwanda it is mostly songs or dances and all that. And I think if eventually someone responded to her in English, and it was addressed by the ministers, and everyone had to remind her that people in Rwanda speak English, but I don't think it would have helped if no one in Rwanda was able to answer her inquiries. And I think the people in Brazil who are going through this same issue, we have now technologies here, and you can do, I'm not sure it's very accurate, the translation is accurate, but you can get an idea of what's happening. I think the problem is us not really taking it in our hands to say what's going on in the world, and wanting to be associated with what's happening all over. So recently we were talking about why are Africans involved in Black Lives Matter and not thinking about what's happening in their countries. I agree, because I agree partly because of course you need to understand what's happening in your backyard before you start looking at what's happening in the world. But understanding where you are, not necessarily where your house is located or your home or where you are as a person. I think it's very important that even if there is a language barrier, we need to be able to do research, to learn. I've seen very many people trying to join the Black Lives Matter movement, but without fully understanding what it means, and using comments like, why don't they just come back to Africa? And these are people who have lived in the United States their whole life, 400 years in the United States. You don't just tell someone who thinks that that's their country. Their ancestors built the country. They built the country. They're contributing to the country's development. You don't tell them, just come back home. It's those dismissive comments that we need to also avoid, but also focus on learning what's happening around us. We need to, like you mentioned, one of Leo Africa's principles is knowledge. Of course, we need to learn. We need to know what's happening around us. What is our responsibility? How can we help? You also mentioned volunteerism. Then that's where we come in, and how can we help as young leaders and make sure that if we're trying to build a strong Black community, and if we're talking about Black identity, how do we make sure no one is left behind? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to start, transitioning towards an exit for this conversation. And I think the best place to begin is to say, okay, what issues are not being included for our attention as Africans, both in the continent and particularly Africans who are connected somehow to being part of the diaspora, living outside the continent, or interested in what is going on around the world. And I'll start with Twasima. Which issues are being left out? What would you rather is included in the current conversation about the progressive direction that Black people can take?
So I think that any conversation around progress has to really be centered on decolonization, because I think that we have to come to a level of understanding of how colonial structures still operate, the ways in which they have altered our lives, and the ways in which they encourage differences that make it impossible for us to have some sort of communal solidarity. I think that we also have to be conscious about the ways in which it manifests even within, like, for example, East Africa, you know, the ways in which we fail to find solidarity with each other, even when the issues that we are fighting for in many cases are very, very similar because of just the persistence of colonial structures. Language is one of those ways in which, and you already touched on this, but they're also, like, you know, we've been saying progressively interesting ways in which we can organize across differences, across languages. In 2018, when we organized the Women's March against femicides in Uganda, they were hundreds of feminists across who perhaps didn't even really have a conscious understanding of Uganda's context who stood with us, right? Similarly, in Namibia and in Kenya and in South Africa and etc. and etc. So there is opportunity there, but unless we fully understand how the systems operate and how they work together to further our marginalization, it will be impossible for us to, because we don't, I feel like many times we don't understand that this is a structural problem, that Africa's problems are structural in nature, and that in as much as we want to hold our leaders accountable, in many ways, they too are a product of this global system, right? So I think that if we come to some level of understanding of how coloniality manifests in our everyday lives, then we'll have an understanding of how exactly do we even build economic consensus? How do we build social consensus? It can only happen if we have an understanding of the systems as they exist now.
So let's go around the room. Please feel free at this point to say, you know, what issues you think ought to be included in the menu for us to consider seriously, but are not addressed ordinarily when it comes to, you know, the future of especially Black and young Africans, wherever they are.
I think I'm happy to go next. As we move forward with, you know, this conversation, and as we become more progressive, I think top on the agenda should also include the youth, who comprise almost 50% of Africa's 1.2 billion in terms of population size. And so I think they need to be at the center. Imagine that potential if harnessed and nurtured. The youth are increasingly mobile, they are educated and ready to take on very complex challenges, and therefore they need to be really celebrated and also encouraged and given opportunities. And second is the whole conversation about gender equity and gender balance, inclusion of more women in leadership positions. We are seeing that a lot, you know, in South Africa, where 50% of the cabinet is women, in Ethiopia, in Rwanda. We need to see a lot more of that in private sector, in philanthropy, in social sectors, to create a more just and equitable continent. Thank you.
Hawa?
Yes, thank you for the input of everyone. I would like to go back again in, the role of culture influence. As someone who came from like a French speaking background, I would like to say that, language was not necessarily a barrier with culture. when we tend to listen to music, to like dance, different arts. And I think it's, on one hand, yes, we tend to value it, but we have to see it as something beyond entertainment. I would say a leverage for influence around the world. And because like, for example, when we talk about Brazil, its influence around the world is quite important, right? We know that like when we identify Brazilian culture, it's actually come from, like a lot of like African descendant aspect. And it's also about acknowledging it and recognizing that no, there is not necessarily one uniqueness, but recognizing that art can also leverage, this global community of like the Black diaspora, whether it's within the African continent and beyond. And something that I really emphasize on is, valuing our artists and our arts. As an artist myself, like I'm also a dancer and a painter, and very often I was told that you should not necessarily continue in those fields. It's not necessarily ladylike. However, I think it's like really deep down in our, in our like collective unconscious to see the potential of art that is a huge, like I say soft power, but it's like it has a great potential in order to leverage our influence around the world. Thank you.
Rebecca, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I think as Africans, we need to realize that we do not have the privilege to decide what oppression to attend to first and which one can wait. So let's focus on this. This can wait, we shall attend to it later. I think we need to realize that the movement, the revolution has to be collective as a whole. We have to tackle all these injustices together. We cannot let one wait while focusing on this specific one, because these injustices are so interrelated, but then still distinct on their own, right? So you look at issues of climate justice and environmental racism when Vanessa Nakate was speaking out, and you see how Ugandans or Africans at large are quite detached from issues of climate and environmental racism. We see it as a global North issue, yet forgetting that actually Africa is suffering the most when it comes to these issues. But then how the conversation probably has been shaped, I don't know, probably it has been shaped in a narrative that is totally not understanding to the African people or something. I don't get it, but I think this is one of the issues that has to be tackled in our revolution, or should I say if we're to proceed further, it has to be involved. And then the other issue is to do with human trafficking, right? And I saw this, you shared it in the email, but then I saw this also during the End SARS protest, right? So I think the building is called Burj Khalifa. If I've said it wrong, somebody can correct me, I don't know, but I think it's the Burj Khalifa. So I think probably in the second week, it lit up the Nigerian flag, right, in solidarity. And somebody on Twitter was like, oh, even the Burj Khalifa stood in solidarity with Nigerians, this. Somebody was like, hold up. When will they actually hold themselves accountable to the trafficking they're involved in? That this part of the world has actually perpetuated human trafficking, and it has failed to actually hold its own citizens responsible. And people, that's the conversation we don't even want to look at. Even when we're standing in solidarity with probably Africans in the diaspora or at home, we forget Africans in the Middle East. We know that we have relatives. I don't want to assume that each of us has relatives in that part of the world, but I believe we know somebody who's in that part of the world and is doing that sort of work, which is actually dehumanizing, or it may not be dehumanizing per se, but they're in a system that could actually lead them into that situation. But those are conversations we don't want to talk about, or we actually forget to talk about, yet they're very important because they are rooted in our identity as well. Because some of the reasons why, or even the main reason why some of our African sisters and brothers are being treated the way they've been treated is because of their color. They're looked at as less. So that is one issue we have to tackle as well. We cannot ignore it at all. And if Africans realize that the injustices that we're experiencing are because of who we are as a people, probably we might re-strategize in what we're doing and probably rethink what we're doing. But then, yeah, I think those are some of the issues that have been forgotten in our fight. Yeah.
Well, thank you. As someone who lives partly in the UAE, I recognize the issue of migrant labor, particularly domestic labor, and its challenges there, which is something we can get into some details. And I thank you for raising it, Rebecca. Jean-Luc, you have the floor.
Thank you, and but thanks for all the contribution. I think sometimes it's great to just listen, and I just feel like I learned a lot. But today, and we already talked about how the gender, the component is important on the continent, and I think if I would say what could be the priority, and if we need to do something a little bit different, that would be the approach we have of the gender issue. And I spent a lot of time during the last 5 years with girls in villages, and I just feel like that should be the priority, but not just investing on their education or going to school. I think I didn't grow up with my father, and I started working on something that is the missing father in psychology. And I just realized that could be an issue for young men, but for young girls, it's something just horrible sometimes, because you don't have that person who used to be your first love, the person who can help you, to navigate into this world. So my feeling is that we need to put more emphasis on the mental health component. We need to do more, but it's not something you are going to learn at school. It's something that you can learn through music, through sport. But we just need to imagine a little bit differently, by the way we're going to change our continent. Nobody's can come from Europe or the US to tell you what you can do for your girls or for your boys. And it's not just young girls' empowerment. And I think if we want to change something, we need to empower those young girls, but at the same time, we need to do something for our boys. And paying attention to young girls, I just realized that the masculinity is also an issue. So my point is we need to invest more on how we can protect our girls, how we can create an environment where they can develop themselves. And it's both investment on girls and also redefine the masculinity. That could be my contribution.
Yeah, this has been a very rewarding conversation, and the last two of you have raised issues that are really, central. Jean-Luc, thank you for raising the issue of mental health, and tying it with the issue of our unfinished liberation, if I put it like that. A lot of the things that Black Africans face, actually, I read somewhere, has to do with, I think someone called it the grinding, that everywhere you turn, because of the overwhelming challenges you face, not just as a human being, but on top of that, of being Black, is that it kind of grinds on you. And that often we do not address what it means for our own, mental health. And I use that term liberally to mean, how you confront these challenges. And I think part of the challenge of leadership today, like I said earlier, is to provide some empathy, some degree of understanding, such that in our labors we are able to do so with a bit of mental freedom, not in the way of we understand the issues and what, but in an emotional way. To earn the right that other people take for granted to feel free in the world that we occupy. So in bringing this conversation to an end, I'll tell you what I have learned myself from all of you, which is an aspect perhaps I'm going to ask the Institute and the faculty here to consider seriously, is that one way in which to make active Black and authentic leadership work not just in the fashion that we have described it here, taking advantage of Africans wherever they are, is actually entrepreneurship. The impression I get from all of you is that when smart leadership takes action, it produces results. And through those results, we can, establish the kind of liberation, whether it is, via participating in the conscious movement, or via creating jobs. But as Leonard mentioned, one of the overriding challenges for Africa in the continent is the fact that our future is tied to the needs of our young people, employment being one of those. But employment, unemployment, the issues that we're dealing with regard to African dignity, African livelihoods are all tied. And I would like to see a future where we reward our entrepreneurship and our entrepreneurs, that the heroes of our time, if you like, the heroes of our future, are those who confront our challenges with some kind of innovation, that they step up, create enterprises, bring innovation to bear in whatever field that they're engaged in, and then employ as many Black bodies as possible to try and move the needle. So maybe for us at the Institute here, we might think about entrepreneurship as liberation in its very many gradations as the next challenge. And I'm going to share this with my colleagues. I want to thank you, all the panelists who have spent your time. This is what we mean by taking action for leadership. And I'd like to thank our audience, both in Uganda, in Africa, and around the world, for participating in this conversation. This conversation obviously is going to exist online, and anyone can check again with the ideas here, but also contact you and the panel because your profiles are there. And I wish you all the best of luck in your leadership journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Angelo. Thank you to the Low Africa team behind the scenes. We deeply appreciate and are grateful for the invitation.
Thank you, Angelo. Thank you, panelists. Have a good weekend.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.